everybody. We're back again for another week seminar. This week, we're going to talk about a lot of CSS. You will probably, if you've gone through the content of this week's lessons, you probably agree that there was a lot of content and a lot of things to remember. I don't think that it's necessary to remember everything on first pass. Remember also that you always have, the one thing you have to remember basically is that you have the internet. You have resources right at hand to remind you of all the finicky little rules that CSS has plenty of. So basically, just try to have a basic understanding of the tools that you got and the things that you can do. You don't actually need to remember, especially at the beginning, all the details of every implementation of every little rule. So with that in mind, what we're going to do today is I'm going to go through a handful of things that are the most fundamental, and those are the things that it would be good for you to learn so that you don't have to keep on looking them up, because at some point it does get old if you have to look everything up. And it's just going to be a good basis on which you can then build your knowledge of more specific things. But basically, what I'm going to give you today are the most fundamental, the most important. We're going to be talking about two main things that you can do with CSS. One is to change the display and the other of elements, and the other one is to change the position of elements. So what the display means is how the element sits in the line next to the other elements, or whether it does sit in a line or it stacks up under the other elements. So display in CSS has to do with a horizontal space of elements and whether elements can share the space horizontally or not, and therefore fall stacked. And we're also going to talk about positioning, which is more generally how each element is positioned in the whole page, in the whole HTML document. So is the element going to be positioned to the left or to the right, bottom or up, how many pixels, with respect to what? Is it going to be the whole document, or is it just going to be 5 pixels to the left, for instance, with respect to its parent element? So all of these things can be decided by setting the different position property. Okay. Before I forget, remember you have the chat. I'm looking at it right here. If you have any questions, I can do my best to answer them. And if you don't, then never mind. What else? Oh yeah. Before we can talk about positioning and display, though, I want to talk about what's called the box model. I have here the New York Times open because I'm just going to demonstrate live what the box model is. Think about the box model basically as applying to all HTML elements, and what it is basically is that all elements are understood as living inside a box that has several layers. So an element has the content, right? We know content. Content is basically what you can see on the page. But content doesn't just come on its own. Because of the box model, because of how the HTML documents are structured, each element comes in, the content of each element comes wrapped in several layers of space that we can set to different widths, different even colors, or anything we want. So let me show you. Remember, to inspect the element, meaning to see what's behind anything on a web browser, to see the HTML and the other files and the CSS and other stuff that goes into it. You can right click and click inspect at any point, or you can also do a key shortcut, which on a Mac is Shift Command C, and that opens somehow slowly the dev tools. Remember, developer tools, the console is another way of thinking about it. Okay, remember that we have the HTML on top that tells us the basic structure of the file. Let me look. I would like to look at this paragraph here. I'm gonna right click. Sorry, I'm just gonna, if I click on it, once the developer tools are open, if I click on an element, the highlighting is gonna show me, I don't know what this is, so I'm gonna close it. It's gonna show me the element, okay? So if I right click and go to this line element, for instance, it's showing me this. Highlighted here on the HTML, but actually I'm going to stick to this first paragraph that I like. Ignoring the content, not this kind of lesson. I'm going to, so it's a P element, right? It's a paragraph. It has the class summary, and this is the content that we see. Okay, see that when I look at it, when I hover on it, I see the blue content, sorry, the content that's highlighted in blue, but I also see this like orange thing, orange area around it. I want to look at the CSS for this document. Let me bring the style further up so that we have more a bit of a bigger view of it. Okay, so look at this. In this little diagram, the DevTools always shows you the whole box, and hence box model, the whole box for this element, for whatever element you are clicking on, okay? So you can see that the box model has one, the core box is the content box, which is this one highlighted in blue. Then the next one is padding. If you see here, it's green where I'm hovering here on the right in this diagram in the DevTools, but there is no number next to it. So for instance, margin has a 10 right here, but padding doesn't have a number. So that means that padding is set to 0. I'm going to change it so that you see it. And we have here story theme feature summary. This is the class that is going to define this paragraph. So I'm going to say padding. I'm going to say 10 pixels. And if I just give one value, it goes to the 4 sides. So you see now I added padding. So the padding is this green highlighted area. And border, again, there's no border, so I'm going to add a border. So you see border equals, I'm going to say like 2 pixels, and I'm going to make it solid. And I'm gonna make it, now look at this, sorry about that, Facebook alerts. It appeared, this line appeared because I set it to solid, so it is a 2 pixel thick line around the element containing, around the element, which in this case it's understood as the content and the padding. I'm gonna change the color to blue. So now it's pretty. Okay. And then there's the margin. The margin was what we could see at the very beginning. The margin here, you can see how it's set to 0, 10 pixels, 3 pixels. So 0, look at the diagram here. 0 is the top margin. It's set to 0 because there's no number up here on the top of the margin box. 10 refers to left and right, and it's set to 10, clearly. And 3 pixels is the bottom margin. Okay? So basically, what you have here is each content element, each element has 3 layers outside of its content. Well, we have the content, clearly. We have the padding, which is inside the element, and it just can make it look a little bit more padded, clearly. Not explaining. The names are pretty self-descriptive, so they tell you what they're doing. Okay, the padding is going to show inside the border. The border, as the name implies, is the limit, is the border of what the element itself constitutes. And then there's the margin. The margin is like cushioning between elements. So the margin itself is not considered to be inside the element. What's inside the element is the border, but every element has a margin. So that's why the box model, we say like it applies to every element. But the border is what constitutes the, I don't want to repeat myself, but the border of what's inside or what's outside the element. What else? My page is deciding to refresh, which, by the way, remember, when you make changes on the developer tools, on the dev tools, and then you refresh, those changes are lost. So of course, now we're playing around, it doesn't matter, but if you are making changes that you care about, you probably want to be saving them pretty often, or make the changes on your editor, on your text editor, before committing too many changes to these developer tools, and then you refresh, you lose everything. I think this probably has to do with the New York Times refreshing on its own. Okay, so what else? What else can we say? The content of the, let me right click so that we go to this element again. The content of a element, of an HTML element, is where you're going to set the height and the height. Let's say I'm going to make it much taller, make it 200 pixels. Now I've made the content area, you see here, 200 pixels. Of course, like the content, it doesn't occupy the whole, the text inside the content box doesn't occupy the whole 200 pixels, but that's what I've done. I've changed the content box into 200 pixels height, and I can change the width as well. I can make it like really narrow, and then it's ugly as hell, but this is what I've done. It's actually overflowing into the other elements you see here. Maybe I can actually see if I can do, I don't know if this is gonna work. There is this property called overflow, and the good thing about the developer tools is it gives you all the options here. Okay, so overflow is the property that you can set to tell HTML and CSS what to do with the content when it overflows, clearly. I just showed you an example of the content overflowing where this text was going all the way over to cover this second row of articles. But I set it to hidden, and what happened is that basically whatever was set behind, whatever was overflowing or above the 200 pixel height, is hidden. It's as if not if as if it is not there. I can change it to scroll, and then guess what's gonna happen? Well, actually, okay, this is when things get tricky because this is a very complex page, and sometimes there are properties that are set in higher elements that are set to, for instance, important. Remember, this was something that came up in the lesson like two weeks ago, where you can set properties to say overwrite everything. I don't have an answer right now, but I bet you there is a CSS rule somewhere that excludes scroll from working in a column in this page. Okay, but anyway, let's just take out the width of 50 pixels because look, this is what the content looks like now. It's not that I set it to a width of 50 pixels, so I'm going to take it off. Not there anymore. I'm gonna take the height off because that looks really ugly too. Okay, so that's for content. Let me just say a little bit more about the border. Remember, there's no border here, but I can actually set it so that we can play with it. Border. Okay, there are 3 attributes to the property border. Well, first is the color. Okay, I can just set it to whatever color I want. But the default width of the border is set to none or 0 pixels. So basically, you won't be able to see it unless you change the default of the border width. So sure, I set it to azure now, but I can't see it because I haven't set the property to any width. So I'm going to set it to, I can set it to any number of pixels. And there are also 3 built-in ways that I can set it. I can set it to thin, to medium, or thick. So let me just set it to thick so that we make sure we see it. Then the style can be set to solid, which is the default. No, the default is none, so we need to change it. None would be you can't see it. Dotted, clearly, it looks like that, dotted. But let's just set it to thick because the dotted I find pretty ugly. Sorry, not thick. Solid. And what else? Oh yeah, the color. Let's choose the color red. Indian red. I don't know what that is. That's a pretty red. Okay, cool. So that's the border. You can do these things with the border. What else? And then we have padding. It's inside the element, remember, so it's in between the content and the border. And I can set it to, let me just set it to 10 pixels all around so that it looks a little bit more cushioned, right? Padded. And you can set it like this, or you can set padding, not padding generally, but just padding left. Not letting me. Okay. Padding left would be just setting the left padding. Padding right would be just setting the right padding, and so on and so forth. This page is refreshing again. Slightly annoying, but anyway, you get the idea. Let me just show you one thing. By the way, also remember, I'm just going to close this page because I don't like it that it keeps refreshing. Remember that I have in my GitHub the week 4 document with most of the links that we're going to be talking about today. So by any means, go there and you'll have a reference there. I find that with CSS, this page, W3 Schools, which we've talked about before, the theoretical explanation behind it is less extensive than the official CSS documentation, which should be your reference for rule details and syntax. But one good thing that the W3 Schools has is that it has really pretty diagrams, and it has this try it page that you can click on that is basically a playground for you to test whatever rule you're interested in. So I looked for CSS box model, and you get the diagram that I was just showing you, an example, and this try it yourself that shows you a page like this where basically you can play around. So I want to show you one thing that we haven't covered about the box model. What happens when you have two divs, in this case divs, but it could be any kind of element, two elements, one is a paragraph, sorry, no, the paragraph is this one here, right here, but two elements, one div, two divs, next to each other. I want to show you how if you set the padding, remember the padding is inside the border, the padding here is set to 55, let me set it to 15 so you see the change. Now it's like much less padding, right? If you see, in this case it's very clear because the background color of the div is set to light gray, so that's why I really like this playground, so you can see the changes. The padding, because it's inside the element, you have the one element with its content, padding, border, and margin sitting here. If you have another one below it that is like right below it, the padding is just gonna be the padding for the element on top, the padding for the element below. They're gonna just add up. So this is gonna be 15, and since this is the same element and with the same CSS, this is also gonna be 15. These two are not going to collapse. Collapsing would be the elements blend into each other or share padding. In this case, padding is not shared. Each element has its own padding. There's no collapsing. So if you have padding set to 15, you'll have an element set to 15 padding, so it's going to be 15 here, and the second element is going to be 15 padding. So what's going to happen, that in between the two elements you're actually going to have 30 pixels at least, because then you have to add the margin, but they're basically going to add up. However, with the margin is different. With the margin, because margin is what's outside of the element, it's not inside the border, remember. Let me just change the border here to 2 pixels so that, run. Oh, not none, I need to set it to say solid, and I'm gonna make it dark gray. There we go. So now we can see it. Maybe no, I'll make it black because you can't really see them. Dark gray. Okay. Margin is outside of the border, so it doesn't belong to the element. So what happens is that when you, sorry, I did not mean to click enter there. When you set a margin to an element and you have another element below it or next to it, the margins of those two elements will collapse, meaning one of those two margins will collapse and the other margin will remain. So you're not going to have 15 of margin here and then another extra 15 of margin because the element below it has a margin set of 15. What's going to happen is that in this case, the margins are the same, so the margin that's going to show between the two elements is just going to be 15. So this is what people mean when they say margins collapse. They collapse because only one of the two margins that are touching each other will show. If I change this so that I'm going to add a class of small margin class, and I'm gonna set the margin for this one to 5 pixels, and I'm gonna set the second div to class equals small margin. So now I'm gonna run it. Well, margin, again, remember with the margin, you can do margin left, margin top, margin bottom, margin right. So the one I'm interested in is margin top. So I'm just going to change the top margin so that it doesn't look like this. Okay, so what happened here is that I have the top element, the div, well, both divs really have a margins of 15. If I just give one value to margin, it's going to set the 4 sides of margin to 15 pixels. But then I have this more specific class for the second element set to the margin top to 5 pixels, meaning the remainders of the margins are still set by this div CSS specification to 15. So the right, left, and bottom margins of the second div are going to be set to 15 pixels. But the top, because I changed it here in this class that I've just applied to the second div, is going to be set to 5 pixels. But it hasn't actually changed the appearance of this. So let me just take this out for a second. I'm going to just like take it out and run it again. This is 15 pixels in between the two elements. It doesn't change one thing. If I add this again and I run it, it's still 15 pixels. Why? Because margins collapse. So what happens when there is a margin that is, in this case, touching margins? One of them is 15 and the other one is 5. The one that's larger will prevail. So it's going to be 15 pixels, because 15 is larger than 25. If I were to change this to 25 pixels and run it, the margin that prevails will be the 25 pixel one because it's larger than 15, so it becomes 25 pixels. But not 25 plus 15, just 25. And that's why they collapse. Or that's what it means to say that they collapse. Okay, so much for the box model. Let me plug in my computer. The box model is at the basis of everything that follows. Everything is built on top of the box model. Don't think that the box model is not at the basis of everything. It applies to every HTML operation you do, so you have to always keep it in mind. And just basically kind of like take a mental picture of this, and everything else you can Google. Okay. Let's talk about the display property. The display property, which is here. The display property, remember, is a way of setting, of telling the page how to display the elements in a line, whether to do it in the same line or not. Let me see, display property. Okay, let's just play with this page here. That's just pretty handy. Display property, it is a display here, of course, nothing, let me see. Okay. I just can't find. Never mind. Display property. It can be inline. What happens inline? Well, clearly the elements, in this case, these 4 paragraphs with a very boring content, the inline elements, if they're in display inline, they're going to display in a line, like I just said. When you set some elements to display inline, you cannot change the width or the height, so especially the width. So if I change say width 200 pixels, this shouldn't change anything, because with an inline element you cannot change the size of the content. So the height and the width that we were talking about with the content, you cannot change them if the element is set to display inline. So I changed it to 200 pixels, which is way more than this. It cannot change. Now, if you want to be able to change the width or the height of an element displayed inline, you can set it to inline block with a B. If I run this now, it's setting up the elements in a line. So I have the first element here with 200 pixels wide, second, third, and then it runs out of space, so it goes on to the next line, right? That's what inline block does. Inline means in a line, and block in this sense means that you can actually change the width and the height. What if I just say block? Block will actually set the elements. Each element will occupy the whole width of the page, but I can change the height. So if I change the height of a display block, the div, the content, will be much bigger, much taller in this case, because I set it to 200, but it will keep setting the elements in a column, in the sense that each element is going to be in its own separate line. Okay, so you have block for, let me take this out, block for in a column, inline for in a line. Different elements will have different default positions, different display properties. For instance, a div is considered a block element. So if you just take out the display completely and run it, well, this a div and a paragraph as well, their default is a block property, meaning that they will display in a column. Each element that has a display block as default will display on its own line. Paragraphs have their default display property as in block, divs as well, and many others, but also there are elements that have their display property set the default as inline. For instance, an anchor, or if you change the style of a word by using the strong tags, that's also going to be defaulting to inline, meaning that by doing this, you're not going to make it so that the strong string sentence that you have surrounded by the strong tags is not going to stand out and like go to its own line. That would be bad, right? So if you do this, it's actually, you see, going to stay inline. The default for a strong element, and I can take this off if you don't believe me, the default for a strong element is inline, like you can see here. The default for a paragraph element in this case is block, so if I don't set anything, it's going to go to a block style display, meaning each element will have its own line. There is, I did this already. here, this one is really, I like this page a lot because you can, if you ever forget, you can see by just changing the choice here in this drop down in this list, you can actually see what it does. We're talking about the span element, background color red, so it really stands out. And you can change the display property just by clicking here. Display none, actually, like see the CSS code is here, will just make the thing disappear. Initial, we'll just set it to the default, right? This is a span element, which if you think about it, you don't want a span element to go to its own line. So the default is as expected. It's going to go to inline. Inline basically doesn't change the initial because the initial sets it to the default and the default is inline. Block, what's it going to do is going to take out that span element and make it be its own line. And look at this, the element's width will actually become, by default, because you can change it, but by default it's going to become the whole width of the parent element. List item is another one, it just becomes a list item. Okay, so much for display. What else? Let me close this. Position. Okay, so now we know how to change elements with respect to how they sit on one line or several lines. That's the display property. We have also the position property. The position property is going to change how the element sits in the whole page. So you can basically take an element, change the position property, specify a certain number of pixels, and move the element from its default position, which will be somewhere in the flow of the page. The HTML flow is basically the way in which HTML interprets how to put the elements on the browser page by reading it from the top to the bottom. The flow is the HTML interpreter is going to go to the top of the element and read to the bottom, and it's going to be placing the elements as they happen while the document is being interpreted. That's the flow. You can change that by using the position property. Okay, let's see. Let me start with this. Okay, this one again is from the W3 Schools. I'm using this because what I want to show you is a fundamental frame of reference of how these properties work. So it's really handy, it's really useful to do this with a very simple example. And then once this is clear in your mind, you will see examples in live web pages and you'll be able to understand it better. So, again, let's see what we have here. We have this div, ID my div, which here in the style tag is set to a border that is 1 pixel solid black, clearly. Background of light blue, so this way we see what's inside the element. Remember, the element will also have margin. A margin is going to be outside the border, right? So if I set the margin to 20 pixels, it's going to make the element move 20 pixels down and 20 pixels to the left of this left edge of the document, but it's not going to make the element any bigger. Boom. So that's what just happened, right? That's setting the margin. Let me just take this out for a second. I set the width and the height to 300, but I can just, like, if I take out the specific widths and heights, the default for the width and height of an element is going to be basically determined by the content. So I actually, the div goes the whole width, but the height is going to be determined by the content, and the content has 3 lines, so it's not going to go further than that. I'm actually going to make the width a bit narrower so that we can see 300 pixels, so that we can see better how it works. Okay. What else? What is happening here? Okay, we have a position relative. Let's change this to absolute. Position absolute. What's a position? Position says how far from a specific point the element is going to be positioned with respect to the top left corner of whatever parent or point is relevant for that property. I know this is a little bit too abstract, but let's just start with absolute. If you set an element's position up to absolute, the element, the specification, I'm going to move this to above here because it really is not relevant to the position in this case. I want you to focus on the position absolute and the top 10 pixels. This is saying from the top, move the element 10 pixels. From the top of what? It's going to be from the top of the nearest parent, or the nearest container, or the parent of the element. Look at this div. The nearest element that is containing it is the body, right? So it's going to go to the body tag, the body element. In this case, that's the whole page, and that's why it goes to the top of the page. And it's going to place it 10 pixels from the top. I can actually change this also to left 30 pixels. What do you think is going to happen here? Well, because the position is absolute, the element is positioned with respect to the top left corner of its parent element. That is the body. That's going to be this corner here. So it's going to be 10 pixels from the top, 10 pixels from the top, plus 30 pixels from the left. So if I run this now, it's going to move this div 30 pixels from the left, which means towards the right. And that's what just happened. It moved to the right, okay? Position absolute, if you see this, what I'm doing here, actually, it takes the element out of its original position and it places it on top of whatever is under it. So it doesn't care if there's anything there where you're saying you should position it. If there's something, whatever, it's going to go on top. It's like the element whose position is absolute becomes like a floating element on top of everything else, and you're going to set the position of it by setting the top and left elements, and it's just going to go there. It's not going to care if there's anything underneath it. Because of this, you don't really want to use this position absolute very much because it's sometimes too powerful. It will hide things, and that's many times not what you want. Now, if I set the position property to relative, now what it does is saying, see the top element, see the parent element. The parent element of this div, it's still the same, it's the body, right? But it's saying where there is room for this div, set it to 10 pixels from the top and 30 pixels from the left. But where is there room? Well, first it's going to be seeing this paragraph, click the try it button, blah, blah, blah. Then it's going to have the button, and because it's not going to place this div element that we're setting to position relative on top of something that's already there, it's going to wait until there's room. It's going to say, okay, this is your position in the code, so this is where I'm actually going to relativize your position. So it leaves room for whatever is on top, and it just sets the position with this properties that you set it to, but only in the space that is saved for the element. And that's why this is more powerful, because many times you don't want to break out the flow, take the element out, and just have a floating element that's going to hide things. So I can just say relative, position relative, and then within that relative position of the element, in this case the div, I can set it to whatever I want to set it to. In this case, 30 from the top and 30 from the left. What else? Another way of setting an element to be always there and not hiding is fixed. If I say fixed, in this case, the div is in its default position, which is right below. I actually don't like how this is so close. This triad element is so close from the div element. So I'm going to give it, would it be margin or would it be padding? Well, I don't want to change the padding because I don't want it to look any different from the inside of the border. I want to change just the margin, right? So I want to change the margin and also just the margin top of this element because all I want to do is separate the try button from the div element. So margin top, what could I do? Maybe like 20 pixels. So it looks a little bit cushioned. So I'm going to run it. Okay, that looks better. So if I set it to fixed though, that means that this element is not going to change position, even if things change around it. So in this case, for instance, there is only these two things on top of it, and that's why it looks good. But I set this position to fixed. So what happens if I decide to add loads of P elements on top and more buttons and more things going on? Well, because it's set to fixed, what do you think? This element is not going to move. It's not going to care. In this case, it did move. So what I'm thinking of is absolute, obviously. Top 10 pixels. Okay. This could look good to start with if it was just 50 pixels and I had this elements like they were at the beginning. This would look good, right? But if I add these paragraphs and I run it, because the position is set to absolute, it's going to look ugly, very ugly. So if I just set it to relative, because that's the important contrast, I can change this to just 30 like it was before. Then I can add anything I want or take out anything I want, and it's going to keep the basic structure in between the content that's already there and this element. The fixed property, it's hard to demonstrate in this context, but the fixed property will fix it so that if there is more content and you're scrolling down, that fixed element is going to stay put. What else? Okay, we only have 10 minutes left, but I want to introduce this extra tool called the Flex Box that is very powerful. Lots of these things do similar things, and it's all about what's going to be better for the specific situation that you're in. So if you think that some of these things there's overlap, that's because there is. You can do things with, oh look, this is a good example for a fixed position. Position fixed. Because I have this paragraph that I can set from the top a different number of pixels, but because this is fixed, I can move this to right behind it, and it's not going to care. The header is fixed, it's going to stay put, it doesn't care what happens underneath. Basically, a fixed position element also comes out of the flow, becomes a floating element, and stays in that position, whatever is happening behind it. Okay, so that's fixed. Flex. Flexbox is another set of tools that can help you put elements in a row in a certain way or in a column in a certain way. I've added this Flexbox visual guys here so you can take your time to look through them. This is a whole world of more CSS rules, loads of specific rules. Don't worry about understanding everything or remembering everything, because these things are easy to understand. It's just that there is hundreds and hundreds of different rules and it becomes impossible. But what is Flex? Flex is a way of setting an element, in this case a flex container, and that gives you a certain number of ways that you can position the elements, the items, the flex items inside the container. Okay, so actually, where is it? I'm looking for, I think this is it. Think of, okay, here we go. This is what I was looking for. Sorry about that. If you create a flex container, so basically to use the Flexbox tooling, you need to create a flex container. A flex container is basically an element that contains other elements that have this property. So a flex container, in this case, we name the class flex container, but you can name it whatever. But flex container is helpful because it is descriptive, right? So if I have a class called flex container and the display is set to flex, basically any element that has that class will be a flex container. And then any element inside that flex container is going to be a flex item. Let's go back to this diagram. This is where I want to focus on for a couple of minutes. This is a flex container. A flex container contains flex items, and it's important to remember that there are two axes to any element, but when it comes to Flexbox, they're really important to understand the rules. The main axis is the one going across, left to right, and the cross axis is the one going top to bottom or bottom to top. Okay, so if you have a flex container with flex items in it, you can set different properties to that container so that the items in it will be positioned in different ways with respect to the main axis or with respect to the cross axis. So it's going to be important to remember main axis left to right, cross axis bottom, top to bottom. Let's see if we can do a okay. By the way, if you ever see things like WebKit Flex Wrap or WebKit Flex, this is just because Safari has its own way of expecting things. So sometimes you need to write code that's going to be specific for Safari in this case, or different versions, different browsers sometimes expect things slightly different. But what's important here is that the main element, main is this div here, which is the father, the parent element of all of these A, B, C, D, E, F elements. This main element is set to display flex. Display flex means this is a flex container. So all the things in it, A, B, C, D, and F, are going to be flex items. I can set, forget about flex wrap for a second. I want to talk to you about flex direction, which is the first most basic property for a flex box use. Flex direction basically is looking at, where is it again? Here, the main axis, and is saying set the elements, the items, the flex items inside this flex container on the main axis in such a way. Different ways, of course, for different properties. Flex direction. I can set it to row. What does it mean? It means that this is stuck. I'm sorry. But if I set the flex container, flex direction to row, what's going to do is that it's going to set the items inside the element, inside the container, in a row from left to right on the main axis. So let's see if this one works better. Flex to row, flex direction, row. I'm going to run it. The main axis, remember, is left to right, so it's going to set them from left to right on the main axis, A, B, C, D, E, F. If I do row reverse, it's going to set them, these items, in this order that I'm giving them, but from right to left. So it's like reading backwards. It's going to be A, B, C, D, E, F, but from left to right. If I set flex direction to column, again, think about the main axis. It's going to be understanding each element in a block-like display, so in each one on a different line, but reading it from top to bottom, so A, B, C, D, E, F. If I do it column reverse, it's going to do the same that it did from the top to bottom, but from the bottom to the top, meaning it's going to start at the very bottom, and it's also going to order them backwards, A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay? I know this is a lot. I don't think that it's good to try to remember everything at the same time. Just remember that if you set a container to display flex, you are going to have many tools that you can use to display elements inside that container. This is a very helpful tool when you have one element and you want to do magic inside that element. There's a lot of guides online. I've added a few here in my in the week 4 document for you to play around. But just remember a few of the basic tools, remember the box model, that's very important, and play around and it will all settle down the more you do it. What else? Remember to use the one-on-one mentors. Those are very helpful if you get stuck with this kind of thing. Remember, Google things around. Remember, read the details of the rules and use this kind of like playground here, W3 Schools, try it, or the Replit, which I've shown you before. This is also a really good way of making really small changes to basic files to see those rules acting in isolation from very complex CSS files. And that's it. Next week we will continue with more CSS tools and we'll work on responsive websites. So this has all been set to one size screen. We can work on changing how the CSS is set up so that depending on the size of the screen, it actually behaves differently, so it doesn't look horrible on a little phone or an iPad. And that's it. I think that this is good for today, and have a good week, and speak to you next week.